We are still compelled. Artifacts of Bluffton's World War I experience. This is a lecture originally presented on Sunday, March 10th, 2019 for the Voices of Conscience event series, and I'm Carrie Phillips, Archives and Special Collections Librarian for Bluffton University. As World War I began in July 1914, Bluffton College and Mennonite Seminary was just over a year into its new existence, having dissolved Central Mennonite College in spring of 1913 in favor of a reorganized institution with a new name and a new board of trustees. The Whitmarsum, the campus monthly, was even younger, having published its first issue in October 1913 after students returned to their new school to begin classes. From what one can gather from the Whitmarsum's reporting, the conflict in Russia and Europe was slow to enter the campus conversation. It wasn't until the March 1915 issue when the war appears to begin influencing campus events. On March 5, 1915, the campus Alethian and Athenian Literary Society's joint program featured a debate on President Wilson's war policy, with Clarence Beery arguing successfully for the affirmative. A peace oratory contest was announced for Tuesday, March 30th, in which 5 students from Boyd Smucker's public speaking course would discuss peace and war in a public event in the college chapel, the winner earning a chance to speak at a state contest. That winner was Waldo Schumacher, a sophomore student from Pandora, Ohio, who presented The Peace Problem, which won him first place by unanimous vote of the judges. In the next month's issue, the Whitmarsum printed a photo of Schumacher, along with excerpts from his winning speech. I'll read a few excerpts of Schumacher's speech because I suspect that Professor Smucker was quite impressed by his students' wise words. Here's one quote. "True patriotism is born, not of pride, but of humility. It is supported by love of mankind, not merely one part, but all humanity. That God is our Father, and that all men are brethren. This oneness of humanity must be inculcated in the minds of the people ere we shall have everlasting peace." And here's a second quote. "Countless millions of dollars have been and are being spent annually in order to appease the war god. For his sake, our own country sacrifices 70% of all monies collected by the government, while 1% is spent for promoting agriculture. Instead of melting our swords into plowshares, as the prophet tells us someday shall be done, we are actually melting our plowshares into swords. Is it just and honorable that such sums should be spent for warfare and an insignificant sum for agriculture, although the prosperity and very existence of the country depends not on the man behind the gun, but on the man that follows the plow? How much woe and misery could be averted if these sums were spent to better feed and clothe the poor, to better educate the masses, and to combat sickness and vices?" Schumacher would eventually serve with the United States Army at the base hospital of Camp Sherman in Chillicothe, Ohio, and we'll hear from him again in a little while. The title of today's talk, "We Are Still Compelled," comes from a line in an essay published in the 1917-1918 Bluffton College ISTA yearbook, in a section of pages devoted to the wartime situation. This was an eventful year in the history of our institution. It was the school year which immediately followed Wilson's declaration of war and the passing of the Selective Service Act, and the demographics of the student population would begin to shift significantly as more and more men were drafted or enlisted in wartime service. President Woodrow Wilson's portrait opens this section and is captioned, "The world must be made safe for democracy," from Wilson's April 1917 address to Congress requesting a declaration of war against Germany. A photograph of the Bluffton College service flag, purchased in March 1918 by Student Senate for display in College Hall, is surrounded by an open letter from the yearbook's editor to the Bluffton College boys in the service, offering messages of pride, appreciation, and encouragement. This editor was Vernon Ramsire, who would himself spend a significant amount of time in uniform at Camp Dodge in Iowa before shipping off to France in early fall 1918. A listing of 78 names across the next 2 facing pages shows the wide scattering of Bluffton's men, from Camp Sherman in Ohio to the YMCA offices in New York City to the American Expeditionary Forces overseas. The editors devote a page to the memory of Fred Bixel, a Bluffton student who, while serving at Camp Sherman in Chillicothe, Ohio, succumbed to pneumonia. This was very likely due to influenza, and the flu epidemic would quarantine the town of Bluffton the following fall. The staff of the Whit-Marsum, the student newspaper, contributed Somewhere, an essay on the ways in which praying for peace and overcoming discord require sacrifice from all who are touched by war. The ISTA closes its war-related section with a photograph composite of a number of Bluffton men in service, with many shown in their uniforms and/or in camp. The Somewhere essay I mentioned was a reprint of the first editorial published in the September 13, 1917 issue of the Whit-Marsum. With this first issue of the year, the Whit editor, Eddie Stauffer, and assistant editor Ruth Ringelman transitioned the paper from a monthly publication with more literary content and long-form reporting to a weekly news sheet, the likes of which the Whit would remain for the rest of its tenure in print. War-related news content was frequent in the pages of the Whit. Readers would hear from a number of voices, those of conscience, but also voices of support, humor, and creativity, responding to the Great War in many ways, in addition to the regular campus news reporting printed each week. In the November 17, 1917 issue, the Whit reported on fundraising efforts, praising the college for oversubscribing its $1,000 goal for the YMCA War Fund in only 36 hours. The Whit also reported on a week of special prayer meetings sponsored by the YM and YWCA organizations on campus. The women of Ropp Hall, 60 volunteers in all, started in spring 1917 cutting and sewing 6 of 9 hospital outfits for a Red Cross box before commencement. They continued their efforts the next fall and answered this plea printed in the December 8, 1917 issue of the Whit to help the town's Red Cross chapter produce 1,000 surgical dressings. In the same issue, students learned of the enlistment of Whit editor Eddie Stauffer and his classmate Cy Welty. The Whit published a number of poems by Hilda Leet and other students. Male alumni, even today, will know well Miss Leet's lyrics to the Men's Pledge Song. Very little of this content seems particularly anti-American or seditious, but a visit to Bluffton's campus by 2 Secret Service agents on April 19, 1918, proved that the paper was being watched by government officials. As dean of the Mennonite Seminary, J.H. Langenwalter reported to President Moseman, who was off campus in Mountain Lake, Minnesota at the time, quote, "Yesterday, 2 Secret Service men arrived to find out why we had, quote, appointed a censor on patriotic news in the Whit-Marsum," unquote. Dean Byers and Dr. Smith and Tierstein waited upon them and fully satisfied them. They finally called in the editors of the Whit-Marsum and gave them some very sane advice. The whole matter gave Dean Byers a text for the best sermon I have ever heard in a long time. He made a clean break of the matter in chapel this morning and did it in a most masterful and wholesome way. Now, sadly, we have no idea what the best sermon ever sounded like, because Byers' words have been lost to history. However, we do know that the Whit-Marsum ceased publication for that school year. No further issues were printed after the April 6th issue. One could speculate that this incident inspired the editors of the ISTA yearbook to include Wilson's portrait. The Whit-Marsum resumed publication at the beginning of the next school year. The Whit editors were persistent in their encouragement to students on campus to write to Bluffton men in service. Addresses were published in the paper, and the updates were printed whenever changes came across the newsroom desk. The Whit printed letters from the men, written by the men back to campus. From a quick count, nearly a dozen, from the start of the draft in 1917 to the armistice 18 months later. According to the 1918 ISTA yearbook, the press club endeavored to send each of our boys in training camps a copy of the paper free of charge each week, thus allaying their loneliness and at the same time showing our patriotism and interest in them. Men in camp were grateful to have both letters and issues of the Whit to keep up on the events happening back at home. H.W. Berkey, in a letter back to campus in January of 1919, said, "We shall never be able to repay, except in more zealous endeavors in the future, the many little friendly missives we have continually received while separated from our home ties. I assure that from true sources and from stray copies of the Whitmarsum that found their way to Picatinny Arsenal. I have kept in anxious touch with the college. We can thank President and Mrs. Moseman for the trove of letters they saved, first-hand accounts from Bluffton men in service of all types during wartime. These men spoke fondly of their time at Bluffton, much like feeling homesick or missing Bluffton as much as their own families. In addition to the more mundane kinds of news, how busy they were at camp, how the food was, and the weather, the men would ask their president for advice on how best to follow their voices of conscience in their minds, and they would share remarkably wise and mature reflections on their circumstances. They noted how well Bluffton had prepared them for the kinds of experiences they were witnessing. They reflected on their work as enlightening. They observed the differences in educational background converging in the camps, remarking on how much illiteracy they observed and how they could help solve it, or how much alike their campmates were even though they came from different walks of life. A number remarked on the desirability of college men in certain Army roles, and others commented on the absolutism they observed. So let's hear some of their voices. Harry Kohler, drafted into the Army and sent to France, noted in an October 1918 letter that he had been released from his regular Sunday duties in order to serve as regimental song leader for Sunday worship services at the YMCA Center in his camp. The YMCA proved to be a vital resource for the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of the men in service, and many of the letters we have were written on YMCA stationery. William H. Egley, Bluffton College English professor, asked Moseman for a letter of recommendation on his behalf to the Surgeon General so that he could be transferred to reclamation work. Moseman obliged, and we learn in other letters that 3 months later, Egley was transferred to the Quartermaster's Corps to perform financial duties, perhaps in response to Moseman's plea to the Third Secretary of War to take Egley further from the possibility of combat. Homer Moser, in camp with William Egley and desiring non-combatant status like Egley, asked for similar assistance from Moseman, saying in his letter, "One of the lieutenants wanted to give me the impression that we could be forced to fight. Perhaps they are simply testing us. If that is the case, we are perfectly willing to be tested, but it appears to me that they think we will not say any more, and will just naturally fall into it." Lest you think Bluffton men escaped harassment for their choices on conscience, Moser goes on in the same letter to tell the following story. "The company changed captains last week. Our present captain surely does not seem to act the man. Perhaps the next captain will treat us better. As far as I am concerned, he has not wronged me, but I overheard a conversation between the captain and another Mennonite here. He told him that he wanted him to understand that when the rifles were issued, he was to get the first one. On the rifle range, he was to fire the first shot, and as long as he was commander of Company G, there would not be such a class as conscientious objectors, and that we must all be willing to kill." Abram Rickert described flu prevention measures at Camp Sherman in October 1918. "About half of the men of our company are on the sick list at present. Most of them seem to have the grip. A number of them have been taken to the hospital. In connection with this, I must say that the government does everything in their power to protect the health of the soldiers. Everything is kept clean and sanitary. For the last few days we have been carrying our beds out every morning, and we leave them out in the sun all day. The floors have been oiled, and they are not swept at present. Just mop them up so there will be no more dust than is possible to make. A piece of canvas has been hung between each bed to keep the men from inhaling each other's breath during the night." Remember our speech contest winner, Waldo Schumacher? Time at Camp Sherman had not tempered his love of words and language. A letter to President Moseman in January 1919 included the following reflection. "Army life has its advantages and disadvantages, most the latter, but one thing I know, that the fundamental principles for which the Mennonites stand, these principles adapted to changing and ever-varying world conditions, are in the end the beacon lights that must guide struggling peoples to higher and nobler ideals. That universal military training and a large navy which so many in our country advocate will precipitate another struggle within several score years." Vernon C. Ramsire wrote to Moseman from Camp Dodge, Iowa, on July 4, 1918. I have been doing my best to be a good soldier, and was awarded for my efforts by being made a corporal a few days ago. Am in the infantry, rather to my dislike, as I always wanted to get into the artillery, but now is no time to whimper about anything like that. Am doing combative service. It was a great question in my mind, but I did not settle it without a great deal of thought, and now feel as though I am doing just what I was told to do. As I learn to know the men, I find there is not a one who enjoys taking a human life. I feel that if they have no recourse, I should have none either. My lieutenant told me the other day that some of the Dakota Mennonite were causing lots of trouble, as they will not do a thing. Moseman replied to V.C. Ramazire, saying, "The American boys have been giving good account of themselves in France the last few days, as I knew they would. No one doubts the outcome, for we all know the boys that are going across. I do feel that peace may not be so far off. Since we are in the war, I hope there will be a conclusive peace, which can come only through a complete victory. German militarism should be so thoroughly discredited that no nail will be left to hang a shred of it on. Otherwise, we might become the heirs of the system." Representing a more progressive approach to pacifism and concern for institutional safety and survival, President Moseman walked a careful line. The College Leaders Balancing Act included repeated attempts at bringing public figures to campus for speaking engagements. By the start of 1917, President Moseman resumed his efforts to recruit Ohio Governor James M. Cox to come to Bluffton and deliver a commencement address, and he finally got a tentative yes from Cox in February. Cox urged Moseman to check with him again prior to printing programs, which Moseman did at the end of March. Cox took a week to reply, and in a short letter sent his regrets, saying, "My time is not at my disposal." Moseman replied on April 11, 1917, with the following letter, which I'll read because I think it lays out well the circumstances in which Moseman found himself as the country entered war and conscription talks swelled. "My dear Governor, Bluffton College is under control of the Mennonite Church, whose creed forbids her members to participate in war in any form, of which fact our national government has taken cognizance in the National Defense Act of June 3, 1916, as well as in the conscription bill now pending. Personally, I believe that the national government should cancel all special prerogatives of any religious denomination or sect whenever said denomination or sect ceases to make as great or greater contribution to its country in the higher interests of peace than any bearing of arms might be. Believing it to be the duty of each citizen to bear his part of the burden of war and his share of its perils and to avert its horrors, I hereby tender my service to you. Assign me to any work that I can do. For the students of Bluffton College, I wish to say that they stand ready, through the Red Cross and through any hospital unit, as well as through the Young Men's Christian Association, to do all that lies in their power to alleviate the sufferings of our soldiers, and to inspire our young men in camp with high ideals, or to do any work that they can do to which you may call them. We are about to organize a Red Cross unit in the college. The physicians of the town are ready to give such help as they can. I should be glad for any information that will help us in carrying out this purpose. It shall ever be my aim that Bluffton College may contribute to our state and nation, at least in a small way, such ideals as will make impossible forever a repetition of the present world horror. Obediently yours, Samuel K. Moseman. These difficult circumstances carried through the 1917-18 school year. Reflecting on the situation, Moseman told his Board of Trustees in June 1918 that, quote, "The war is a hard test for a Mennonite institution. Opposition to war is written deeply in the history of the Mennonite Church. Love of country and loyalty to it is equally deeply rooted, especially in the student body at Bluffton College," end quote. Moseman was a defender of traditional principles of pacifism, but he also encouraged Bluffton draftees to cooperate with officers and to advocate for their own rights to non-combatant service. This all had to be done carefully, as vigilante mobs were watching the pacifists in Bluffton and targeted Mennonites in this area. Now let's meet a few other students. You heard me mention Ruth Ringelman's name earlier as assistant editor of the Whitmarsum. Ruth followed her younger sister Marie to Bluffton College from their home in Geary, Oklahoma, in the fall of 1916. I'm sure that you can think back to your school days and picture the student who was diversely involved on campus, had a penchant for entertaining, spoke and wrote eloquently and confidently, and wore a smile, or more likely a clever smirk, in every photo you have of him or her. And that, I imagine, was Ruth Ringelmann to her peers. According to the yearbook, Ruth was active in drama, choral society, the campus YWCA club, the Philomathian Literary Society, and the press club, from which she served as editor of the Whitmarsum after Eddie Stauffer enlisted. The Ringelmann sisters would graduate together in 1919. Marie would return to Bluffton following her graduation to assist in the president's office and coach women's basketball, while Ruth eventually became a teacher and moved to California. The sisters were nieces to President Mosimann. Ruth and Marie's mother, Susie, was a sister to Mosimann's first wife, Amalia Crable. Emma Good was a member of the class of 1921. From Washington, Illinois, Emma was also a Philo, a member of the Student Senate and the Girls' Glee Club, and she was involved in home economics activities. Emma married Wilmer Shelley, pictured here. After both graduated from Bluffton, Wilmer pastored several Mennonite churches, and Emma was a high school home economics teacher. After retirement, they were members of First Mennonite Church in Bluffton, and Emma was a resident of Bluffton's Mennonite Memorial Home at her death in 1991 at age 95. These women are important to this talk because of these two books, the scrapbooks that each of them kept of their time as students at Bluffton College. I'm not certain of the campus bookstore situation of the day, but it seems likely that both purchased their blank B books from the same vendor, and they are both like a time capsule for the life of a Bluffton student in the late 19-teens. Scrapbooks are my favorite piece of Bluffton University memorabilia because they capture the creator's personality in ways that a single letter or a photograph cannot do. Scrapbooks are special because they usually include ephemeral items that would have otherwise been thrown away. Often they're constructed chronologically, or at least in part, so it's easy to get a sense of the passage of time and the experiences the creator felt were most important to document. For a preservation specialist or conservator, however, they can be a nightmare. They're often large and cumbersome, constructed with weak bindings. Their pages are usually made of highly acidic paper with a high lignin content. Lignin is what makes your 1980s paperbacks or old newspaper clippings turn to brittle cornflakes. These large books with all kinds of inherent vice are being asked to support a whole array of artifacts: thick, thin, light, heavy, flat, 3D, organic, inorganic, and themselves made of questionable construction, affixed with all manner of glues, tape, pins, string, nails, or other more unusual fasteners. To me, though, they are delightful in their challenges and complexities, and I'm very excited that I have two of them relevant to this talk today. Here are two photos from Ruth's book labeled Good Morning and Good Night of some of the fellows outside one of the men's dormitory houses. The man on the top of the stack in the left picture and on the far right in the right picture is A.C. Berkey, longtime Bluffton College coach for whom Berkey Gym is named. Ruth went along with the women's debate team to Ada to be a Bluffton timekeeper in a debate with Ohio Northern in March of 1917. The debate topic was resolved that military training should be made compulsory in the high schools of the United States. And in what strikes me as a delightful bit of irony, the Bluffton women argued for the affirmative and won. Ruth's book includes this photograph of a Halloween party in Ropp Hall. Emma's classmate Omer Amstutz doodled this hydrogen molecule and wrote her a poem while Emma was trying to stay awake in H.W. Berkey's chemistry class. Ruth speaks of this geometry blue book as a fine piece of literature, the most valuable compilation of any work of literary genius since the time of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Both women included copies of this photograph of the student body gathered on the steps of Ropp Hall for Dress Up Sunday, and Ruth's book notes that this was during the flu ban of 1918, when there was a short period of time where the town of Bluffton was quarantined, and though the college continued to have classes, the students were kept here. Ruth logged her tickets to the Faroe Opera House in Lima and other trips off campus to see theater performances. In August 1918, Ruth received a letter from Wilmer Shelley shortly after he'd arrived in London. She attached the envelope to the scrapbook page and noted on the envelope in ink, "My first letter from over there." I was excited to be able to coax the letter out of its envelope, and I scanned it before putting it back. And I'll read it to you now. Dear Ruth, I suppose you have received the card informing you of my safe arrival overseas. The trip was rather tiresome with no change of scenery, but after a little excitement we finally sighted the coast of Old England. The same looked good to yours truly. However, the convoy system is quite efficient, and whenever a submarine makes its appearance, it receives a ready welcome, and they must come up before they can attack. If I could tell you all about the trip from the time we left New York until our arrival at this camp, I could write you a dozen sheets. On the way from our port to this camp, we passed through a large city where the people gave us a dandy reception, including a light lunch and an address by the Lord Mayor. At present, we are in a rest camp and will stay here something like a week. Then we will be sent to a field for further training before we tackle Fritz. England is very pretty, at least the part we came through, and is very interesting, especially when one has had a previous study of England and English history under Smith. I don't know if any other college fellows are over here besides Eddie Stauffer, who is in France. If you have any addresses, will you please send them? Do you know where Kratz is? Ruth, I hardly know what to write. You must wait till I get back there if I ever see you, and you had better figure on about a week if you desire a detailed explanation and account of this tour. I don't know when any mail will reach me, but please keep on writing. It will reach me sometime. Remember me to everybody, especially Mrs. Yoder, and tell the Bluftonites to write. Sincerely, Wilmer. We'll come back to Wilmer in a moment, but here's one more image from Ruth's scrapbook. Keepsakes in Ruth's scrapbook suggest it was common practice for students to gather for a sending-off party before men left campus for camp. The crepe paper flag in the top left corner of this slide is an example Ruth saved from a party for fellow student Homer Geiger's send-off. The America First streamer in the upper right-hand corner startled me when I first saw it because the only bell it rang for me was with our current president. However, it didn't take much research to learn that America First was Wilson's motto for U.S. neutrality in the beginning of World War I, and President Harding also used it as a campaign slogan for the 1920 election. Both Emma's and Ruth's scrapbooks contain photographs of the celebrations and parade through town when peace was announced. And the students who signed Ruth's book on November 11, 1918, had very good news to write about. I suspect that this photo was taken during May Day festivities in 1919. From the May 17, 1919 issue of the Whitmarsum, we learn, at 8 o'clock, the annual May Day play will be presented by all of Bluffton's sons who were in the U.S. service. The play was written by Edwin S. Stauffer and Professor H.W. Berkey, both of whom have had varied Army experiences. The play is chock full of interesting scenes, such as drilling of the awkward squad, fun of camp life, the pranks of Negro soldiers, scenes overseas amid the bursting of shells and the rattle of machine gun fire, scenes in hospitals and YMCA huts. A beautiful romance is woven into the series of events. The play is titled The End of a Perfect Day, When a Soldier Returns. Many more photographs from that year's ISTA yearbook show these men in their uniforms, suggesting to me that a lot of ISTA photography may have taken place on May Day weekend. This image of a boat was the very last photo in Emma's scrapbook. The caption was written by her husband, Wilmer Shelley, who noted that this was the ship which brought him home from Europe in December of 1918. Wilmer's captions appear throughout Emma's scrapbook, making it just as much his as hers. In closing, this excerpt from the Somewhere essay to which I referred earlier, the essay printed in both the first issue of the Whitmarsum in September 1917 and again in that year's ISTA yearbook at the end of the year, gives context for the phrase, "We are still compelled," and articulates well, I think, the complexities of conscience for the Bluffton College campus community during the Great War. Those of us who remain somewhere in America have to live our parts. We have no doubt but that the Christian training which these men received both at home and at school will mark them as men of influence for the good. Do they get our moral support? Are we thinking of them as men who take an active part in shaping the destinies of all peoples now and hereafter? If we do not realize this fact, we are aiding our enemies just as surely as we would if we would publicly declare our allegiance to them. So trusting that the cause be a just one, let us pray for peace. but we cannot have peace until the god of war is overcome and run off the earth. Militarism is the greatest enemy of the Prince of Peace. In order to consistently pray for the coming of peace, we must at first lend our moral support to the overcoming of the soul of discord. We are firm believers in pacifism, but in order to attain immortality, we must sacrifice. In our souls, we know that even the last measures of sacrifice gives the password to the ranks of those immortal dead, who through their sacrifices live again in our minds, and through their presence make them better. Thus, if not by choice, we are still compelled to strive against standards which are not ours and which do not agree with the dictations of our consciences, in order that we may enjoy the ultimate freedom of thought and conscience. The letters I reference in this lecture and many related photographs, as well as all issues of the Whit-Marsam from the World War I era, are available to browse online at Bluffton University Memory, which is accessible from the Bluffton University Library's website. Thanks so much for watching.